The most dangerous thing a powerful man can do is fall in love with someone who isn't afraid of him. The elevator in Mercy Private Hospital had 12 buttons. Most people never noticed the 13th. No label, no number, just a smooth chrome panel where a button should have been. Accessible only with a magnetic keycard the colour of old blood. Sophia Reyes noticed it on her first day. She noticed most things other people didn't. It was a survival skill, the kind you developed when you grew up in Overtown, in a 2-room apartment above a tyre repair shop, in a neighbourhood where not paying attention could cost you something you couldn't get back. She'd learned to read exits, read silences, read the particular quality of stillness that preceded violence. The elevator opened on the 13th floor at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, and Sophia stepped out into a corridor that smelled like money. Not the antiseptic bite of a regular hospital ward. This was something else. Cedar and leather underneath the clinical baseline, as though someone had tried to make illness feel like a luxury hotel suite, and almost succeeded. The floors were travertine, the lighting was warm and recessed. There were fresh flowers in a vase on the nurse's station counter, white peonies, the kind that cost $40 a stem. Sophia was 28 years old, 5'4", with dark hair she kept in a tight braid when she worked and hands that never shook. She had a nursing degree from the University of Miami that she'd paid for herself. A night shift at a public ER she'd just left after 3 years, and exactly zero tolerance for whatever this was. "You must be Reyes." The woman behind the nurse's station was older, early 50s, with silver hair and the kind of composure that suggested she'd seen things she'd chosen to stop feeling about. Her name badge read, Dr. Elena Vasquez, Chief of Private Care. "I'm Dr. Vasquez. I'll be orienting you." "I was told it was a private patient," Sophia said. "Single assignment." "That's correct." The job listing said oncology support, palliative care adjacent. Sophia set her bag down on the counter. "Who's the patient?" Dr. Vasquez looked at her for a long moment, long enough that Sophia felt the weight of it, and then said simply, "His name is Marco Esposito." The name landed in Sophia's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She didn't move, didn't let her face do anything she'd regret. 3 seconds passed, in which she was 8 years old again, standing in the doorway of their apartment in Overtown, while her mother held the phone and made a sound Sophia had never heard a human being make before and has never heard since. "Reyes, I heard you." Sophia's voice was steady. 15 years of training had made her voice steady through things that would break most people. "Marco Esposito, I'm aware of who he is," Dr. Vasquez said, which was the most diplomatic possible way to say, yes, the most powerful mafia boss in South Florida, the man whose name makes politicians nervous and whose charitable donations have funded half the pediatric oncology wing downstairs. "And I'm aware this assignment is unusual. You were specifically requested." That stopped her. "Requested by whom?" "By his personal physician, Dr. Rinaldi, based on your performance record, your ER experience, your oncology certification, your—" A small pause. "Your discretion." My discretion. Sophia almost laughed. What they meant was, she had no family connections they'd need to worry about, no husband, no children, no parents who could be used as leverage. Her mother had died 4 years ago. There was no one left. "What's the diagnosis?" Sophia asked. "Acute myeloid leukemia, stage 3, recently reclassified from 2 after imaging last week. He's beginning his 2nd round of induction chemotherapy today." Sophia looked down the corridor. At the far end, A door, heavier than the others, a keypad beside the handle. Two men in dark suits stood on either side of it, faces forward, hands clasped in front of them. They weren't hospital security. Their shoes were too expensive, and their eyes were too still. "How long has he been here?" she asked. 3 weeks. He checks in under a different name. The floor is registered to a private medical corporation. As far as the hospital's public records are concerned, this floor is used for storage. A pause. As far as anyone outside this floor is concerned, Marco Esposito is in perfect health and currently attending a conference in Zurich. And his people? The men outside the room? They rotate in 12-hour shifts. They will not interfere with your work. They understand the consequences of doing so. Dr. Vasquez came around the counter and gestured for Sophia to follow. He has requested that nursing staff not discuss his condition with anyone on his security detail. They know he is being treated. They do not know what for. He's keeping his own people in the dark. He's keeping everyone in the dark. You, me, and Dr. Rinaldi are the only medical staff with full knowledge of his diagnosis. There are 3 others on this floor for secondary support, but they have limited access. They were walking toward the door now. The guards tracked them with their eyes, without moving their heads. Sophia kept her posture neutral, her pace even, and tried not to think about the fact that she was walking toward a man who had, in one way or another, shaped the entire trajectory of her life. Not because he'd built her, because of what he'd taken away. "Stop," she told herself. "You're a nurse, he's a patient. That's all this is." Doctor. Vasquez stopped outside the door and turned to face her. In the warm corridor light, she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer," she said. Sophia met her eyes. "All right. Do you have any personal or political objections to providing care to this patient?" The question was clinical, professional. It deserved a professional answer. What Sophia wanted to say was, "My father worked in Overtown for 22 years. He was a good man who fixed people's cars and came home every night smelling like motor oil and made my mother laugh. And then one day he didn't come home, and then the police came, and then his body was found in the canal by the I-95 overpass, and no one was ever charged. And my mother held the phone and made that sound, and I was 8 years old, and nothing has ever been the same since." What she said was, "No." Dr. Vasquez studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. "Good." She pressed her keycard to the pad. The door unlocked with a heavy pneumatic thunk. "He's been awake since 4. He doesn't sleep well during treatment. He may be—" a measured pause. "Difficult." "I've had difficult patients," Sophia said. "Not like this one." The door swung open. The room beyond was large enough to contain a hospital bed, a sitting area, a work desk with 2 monitors, and a floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the Miami skyline, already beginning to glow amber and rose in the early morning light. The city below was waking up. Traffic moved on the causeway. A cruise ship was heading out of the port, white and enormous against the blue-grey water. The man in the bed was not what Sophia had expected. She didn't know exactly what she'd expected. She'd seen photographs, of course. Everyone in Miami had seen photographs of Marco Esposito, at charity galas, at ribbon-cutting ceremonies, in the background of city council photos. He was the kind of man who showed up just enough to be visible, but never enough to be fully known. In those photographs, he was immaculate. Dark suits, dark eyes, a jaw like something carved from Carrara marble, the particular kind of Italian-American handsomeness that turned heads without asking to. The man in the bed looked like that man after something had been quietly, methodically taken from him. He was still imposing, broad through the shoulders, long-limbed, with a physical solidity that illness hadn't yet entirely eroded. The cheekbones were still sharp. The hands resting on the blanket were large and still, but his face was drawn in a way that no photograph would have captured, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of nights far longer than they should have been. He was awake. He'd been awake before they entered, Sophia was sure of it. His gaze moved to her the moment the door opened, not startled, not curious, just assessing, the way a man who had survived as long as he had learned to assess every new variable in every new room. Dark eyes. She'd expected them to be cold. They weren't cold, exactly. They were careful, which was different, and somehow worse. "Mr. Esposito," Dr. Vasquez said, "this is Sofia Reyes. She'll be your primary care nurse for the duration of your treatment." A silence. He looked at Sophia the way she imagined he looked at everything, like he was cataloguing her, filing her, deciding what category she belonged to and what use she might be. "How old are you?" he said. His voice was low and slightly rough, the kind of voice that sounded like it had been used extensively in rooms where other people did most of the listening. There was an accent buried underneath the American, Italian, old and faint, the trace of somewhere else. 28, Sophia said. "You look younger." "I know. Is there anything you need before I review your chart?" His eyes moved over her face with an expression she couldn't quite classify. Not the way men usually looked at her, not appraisal, not interest, or not exactly those things. Something more deliberate. "No," he said. And then, after a pause, "You can set your bag down. You don't have to stand in the doorway." Sophia set her bag down. She pulled up his chart on the tablet Dr. Vasquez handed her and began to read, and she let the medical facts wash over her like water over stone. CBC results, blast cell percentages, the last round of cytarabine and idarubicin, the response rates, the side effects he'd already experienced. She read, and she breathed, and she did not think about the canal by the I-95 overpass. He's a patient, she told herself, for what she already knew would not be the last time. That's all he is. Behind her, Marco Esposito watched her read and said nothing, and the Miami morning came up gold and indifferent outside his window. By the end of the first week, Sophia understood the rules, even though no one had spelled them out for her. Rule 1. The guards outside the door were not to be engaged in conversation. They would not tell her their names. They would nod when she arrived and nod when she left, and in between she was to pretend they were part of the furniture, which was apparently how Marco preferred it. Rule 2. The 2 monitors on the desk in the corner were never to be looked at directly. She'd caught a glimpse on the second day, numbers, names, columns of text that meant nothing to her individually, and probably meant quite a lot collectively. And Marco had reached over without looking up from his phone and rotated both screens away from her with the efficiency of someone who had performed the gesture many times. He hadn't said anything. He'd just rotated the screens and then gone back to his phone, and the conversation they weren't having continued in its usual direction, which was silent. Rule 3. He did not want to be watched while he slept. This was a logistical problem during chemotherapy nights, when he needed to be monitored for adverse reactions. Sophia had solved it by angling her chair slightly away from the bed and keeping her peripheral vision working while she appeared to read. It took her until the fourth night to realize he knew what she was doing and had simply chosen to allow it, which told her more about him than most things. Rule 4, and this was the one she'd had to invent herself because no one told her and she'd had to figure it out from the particular quality of silence that descended when she got close to it. Do not ask about his life outside the room. She wasn't tempted to. She wasn't there to know him. She was there to manage his antiemetics, monitor his central line, draw his blood for the CBC panels, sit with him through the nights when the nausea got bad and the Zofran wasn't quite enough, and maintain the professional boundary that kept her from having to think too hard about who he was. The professional boundary, she was discovering, required more active maintenance than she'd expected. It wasn't that he was charming, though she suspected he could be, in other circumstances, in the way that certain kinds of dangerous men could turn charm on like a switch. It was that he was unexpectedly quiet. She had anticipated intimidation, manipulation, the casual exercise of power that she'd seen men like him, not that she'd met men exactly like him, but men adjacent to him, men who operated in the same orbit, use to keep people off balance. What she got instead was a man sitting in a hospital bed, watching the sun go down over Biscayne Bay, eating ice chips because the nausea wouldn't let him hold down anything else. Reading documents from a leather portfolio that one of the guards brought in twice a day. He read constantly. She hadn't expected that either. On the fifth night, she brought in his 2 a.m. vitals and found him awake, the portfolio closed on the bedside table and a book open in his hands instead. She glanced at the cover as she reached past him for his wrist. The Count of Monte Cristo, in Italian. "You speak Italian," she said, before she could stop herself. It was a violation of the general protocol of not asking personal questions, but it was also just surprising. He looked up from the page. "I was born in Palermo," he said. "What did you think I spoke?" "I didn't." She wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his arm. "I didn't know where you were from." "Most people don't." He looked down at the book while she inflated the cuff. "They know what I am. They assume that's the same thing as knowing where I'm from." Sophia read the numbers, logged them, unwrapped the cuff. His blood pressure was lower than she'd have liked, a side effect of the treatment, expected but worth watching. "How long have you been in Miami?" she asked. It was a mistake. She knew it was a mistake, even as she was doing it, because it was exactly the kind of question that moved the conversation from clinical to personal, which was a direction she'd been specifically trying not to go. 23 years, he said. He'd gone back to the book. "Since I was 19. She did the math without meaning to, which meant he was 42. Which meant he was 42 and had spent 23 years building an empire in a city that was not his, in a language that was not his first, and had done it well enough that his name made people's voices change when they said it. She didn't say any of that. She checked his central line site, clean, no sign of infection, and updated his chart on the tablet. "You should try to sleep," she said. "The next infusion is at 8. I know when the infusion is." "Right." She clicked off the overhead and left the bedside lamp on. He'd made it clear the first night that he preferred not to sleep in total darkness, which she filed alongside the not being watched while sleeping thing as something she would never mention and would never use against him. "I'll be at the station." She was almost to her chair when he said, without looking up from the page, "You're from Miami?" It wasn't a question. She stopped, but didn't turn around. "Yes," she said. "Which part?" A pause. She turned back. He was looking at her now, book still open, but eyes up, and there was something in his expression that she couldn't read. Not cunning, not the particular predatory attention she might have expected from a man like him. Just curious. "Overtown," she said. Something shifted in his face. So small she almost missed it, and fast, gone before she could properly identify it. But it was there. Something that looked, for just a fraction of a second, like recognition. And then it was gone, and he looked back at his book and said, "Good neighborhood to grow up tough." "Good neighborhood to grow up, period," Sophia said, "if you had enough luck." She sat down in her chair and picked up her tablet and stared at the screen without reading it, and tried to figure out why her hands, which never shook, were very slightly shaking. By the end of the second week, she had learned other things. He had a specific method for the nausea. He wouldn't admit to it being bad until it was very bad, and by then he'd already pushed himself past the point where the antiemetics worked optimally. She'd had to learn to read him the way she read her most difficult ER patients, not by what they said, but by the quality of their silence, the set of their jaw, the very controlled way he'd become when something was hurting. "You waited too long again," she said one night, drawing up the Fennigan. "I don't like asking." "Asking who? Asking me?" She checked the line. "It's not asking. It's part of the treatment protocol. The medication works better preventively than reactively, and you know that because Dr. Rinaldi has told you that, and because I've told you that. And yet, every third night, we end up here. I've been managing pain my whole life without pharmaceutical intervention," he said, tightly, through the particular quality of stillness that meant he was nauseous enough that movement was inadvisable. "Good for you. You're in chemotherapy now. The rules are different." He looked at her. She looked at him. She had, in the past 2 weeks, looked at this man more directly and for longer than she suspected most people had in the past 23 years. Because she was his nurse, and it was literally her job to look at him. And she had discovered that looking at him directly, without flinching, produced a reaction in him she hadn't expected. He went still. Not in the dangerous way. Not in the way she imagined he went still before something violent happened. In a different way. Like something in him settled. Like he wasn't sure what to do with someone who didn't look away. "Fine," he said. "Fine what?" "Fine. I'll tell you earlier." A pause. "Next time." She administered the medication. He closed his eyes. She sat back down and watched him breathe, and told herself, firmly, that the warmth in her chest was simply the professional satisfaction of managing a difficult patient effectively. She told herself that for several more minutes before she stopped believing it. The conversation about Overtown happened again on the Thursday of the third week. It was late, past midnight, and he'd had a rough infusion day, and she'd been on her feet for 16 hours, and the quiet of the room at that hour had a different quality than the quiet during the day. More honest, somehow, more stripped of the performance of normalcy. He was sitting up against the pillows, the monitors beeping softly beside him, looking out at the city. His IV was running. She was updating charts. Your family's still there, he said. In Overtown? She kept her eyes on her tablet. No. Where are they? A pause. Sophia set the tablet down on her knee. My mother passed away 4 years ago, she said. My father. She stopped, restarted. I don't have family. I'm sorry, he said, and it sounded, which was the infuriating part, like he meant it. Not the automatic condolence of someone filling a social obligation, something that carried weight. It was a long time ago, she said, which was true about her mother and technically untrue about her father, because some things that happened a long time ago don't go anywhere. They just become part of the floor you stand on. The people we lose early, he said, looking at the window, they don't go anywhere. They just become part of the floor you stand on. Sophia stared at him. He was looking at the city with an expression she'd never seen on his face in 3 weeks of watching it. Not the guarded neutrality he wore during the day, not the controlled endurance of the bad nights. Something older. Something that had been there longer than Miami, longer than power, longer than whatever he'd built himself into. She did not ask him who he had lost. That was a line she was not going to cross, not tonight, maybe not ever. But she filed it away, which she was doing more than was professionally advisable, and told herself again, firmly, clearly, with the full force of her better judgment, that he was a patient, and she was his nurse, and that was all this was, and all it was ever going to be. Outside, Miami burned gold and indifferent below them, and the night was very long. In the 4th week, the world outside the 13th floor tried to come in. It announced itself on a Wednesday morning in the form of a man who was not one of the regular guards, taller than them, heavier through the shoulders, with the kind of neck that suggested a different kind of violence than the measured, trained variety. He was outside Marco's door when Sophia arrived at 6:30, and he was talking in low, rapid Italian that stopped the moment she stepped off the elevator. He looked at her like she was furniture. Nursing staff, the day guard said to the new man, and the new man stepped aside without looking at her again. Marco was awake. Marco was always awake, she'd come to accept this as one of the immutable facts of his existence, like the city below and the white peonies on the station counter. And he was on the phone. He held up one finger when she entered, which she'd learned to interpret as, "I know you're here, I'll be done in a moment, please don't take my blood pressure until I'm finished." She set down her bag and began her setup routine, vitals equipment, medication cart, the small things that had become their morning choreography. "Non è una proposta," Marco said into the phone. "È quello che accadrà." A pause, listening. "Quello che accadrà, Nico. Non discuterlo con me." It's not a proposal, it's what will happen. She wasn't supposed to understand Italian. The assumption was safe to make. Most American nurses didn't speak it, and certainly no one had thought to ask. But Sophia's grandmother on her mother's side had been Italian, from Calabria, and Sophia had grown up with the language in her house the way most people grew up with the radio. Constant background, absorbed without deciding to. She didn't show it on her face. She focused on her supplies. Marco ended the call and set the phone face down on the bedside table. He always placed it face down, she'd noticed, as though the screen itself was a liability. "Sorry," he said. "It's fine." She moved to him with the blood pressure cuff. "Hold still." "I always hold still." "You held still wrong yesterday. You tense your arm and it throws the reading." A faint sound that might, from another man, have been amusement. "I tense my arm wrong." There's a right and a wrong way. You do the wrong one. She inflated the cuff, watched the gauge. Better today, a little closer to where she wanted it. She logged it and moved to check his temperature. And during the ordinary intimacy of the process, his cooperation, her efficiency, the routine that had developed its own particular rhythm over the past weeks, she thought about the phone call and said nothing. Later, when Dr. Vasquez did rounds, there was a conversation outside the room in Italian between Marco and the tall new man, Nico, apparently, that lasted 12 minutes and involved at least one moment where Sophia, passing in the corridor, heard Marco's voice drop to a register she hadn't heard before, flat, final, the way a door sounds when it closes and you understand it isn't going to open again. Whatever it was, Nico left at noon and didn't come back. That afternoon, Marco ate for the first time in 2 days. Not much, half a bowl of pasta that his personal chef sent up in a thermal container, which was a detail that had surprised her. There was a personal chef. He cooked from a rented kitchen 2 floors below and sent food up through a separate service elevator. The guards had their own arrangements. The world outside the door had its own elaborate logistics, all of which existed to serve the fact of this man in this room who was, at his current rate of deterioration, going to have a very difficult next 6 weeks if he didn't start consistently eating. She told him this while he ate his half bowl of pasta, which was not, technically, her job. "I know," he said. "Knowing isn't the same as doing. I'm aware of the distinction." Then, the nausea makes the idea of food intolerable until I'm hungry enough that I eat too fast, and then I'm nauseous again. He looked at the bowl. "I'm aware this is a problem." She sat down in the chair across from him, the sitting area chair, not her nursing station chair, which was a shift she registered and then decided not to examine too closely. "Small amounts more frequently," she said. "I can work with the chef. Low glycemic, easy to digest. You don't have to finish a bowl. You just have to not go 8 hours between attempts." He looked at her for a moment. "You're going to coordinate with my chef. Is that a problem?" "He's been cooking for me for 11 years and has never accepted suggestions from anyone." "He'll accept them from me." Something in his expression, that near flicker of amusement that she was beginning to identify as one of the only honest things his face did. "You're very certain." "I'm very right," she said. "There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What does it mean to you, this work?" The question caught her off guard. Not its content. She'd been asked the question before, by patients, by curious colleagues, by her mother in the years before the end. But the way he asked it, directly, without preamble, as though he'd been waiting for the right moment to ask and had decided this was it. "What does nursing mean to me?" "You're very good at it," he said. "And you're on the 13th floor of a private hospital for a patient most people would find—" A pause. "Professionally undesirable, so I'm wondering what it means to you." Sophia looked at him across the coffee table between them, at the half-finished bowl of pasta and the leather portfolio closed beside it, and the man who looked like what he was, powerful, contained, ill, watching her with those careful dark eyes, and said, "Control." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "I grew up in a place where things happened to people," she said, "where decisions got made above people's heads, where you could be doing everything right and still lose everything because of someone else's choice." She looked at her hands. "Nursing is the opposite of that. You assess, you intervene, you have information, and the information gives you options. You can't fix everything, but you can sometimes change the outcome, and that matters to me. The room was very quiet when she finished. She hadn't meant to say that much. She'd answered the surface of the question and then kept going, which was what happened when you kept very careful watch over your words for months, and then one night at the end of a long shift they found a gap in the wall and went through it. Marco was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face. "Information gives you options," he said. "Yes. I've lived my whole adult life on that principle." He picked up the bowl and took another bite of pasta. "I just never heard anyone else say it that way." Sophia looked at him, and the ground shifted slightly under her feet, and she filed that too, the way you file things you don't want to forget and aren't ready to look at yet. "Eat the rest of that," she said, and stood up and went back to her station. Nights on the 13th floor had a different grammar than days. During the day, there were routines, infusions, vitals, medication rounds, the carefully orchestrated logistics of Marco's professional life continuing through the closed door, the guards who rotated in and out, Dr. Vasquez's rounds at 11 and 3, the chef's deliveries on their precise schedule. During the day, the room maintained a performance of normalcy, of managed control. Nights stripped that away. It started, Sophia thought, somewhere around the 3rd week of treatment, when the cumulative fatigue of the chemotherapy began to override whatever internal discipline Marco used to hold himself in the shape he wanted to occupy. The first 3 weeks, even on the bad nights, he'd maintained a certain, she searched for the right word, composure. Not coldness, not distance, but a kind of managed presentness. He was always aware of her, always, she suspected, aware of everything. But somewhere in the 5th week, the nights began to change. She came on at 10 p.m. to find him awake and sitting not in the bed, but in the chair by the window, which was technically not in her instructions from Dr. Rinaldi. The chair was fine, the mobility was encouraged, but the way he was sitting in it was different. Not the controlled, upright presence he maintained during business hours. He was leaning back, one arm along the armrest, and the window in front of him showed the city blazing below, and he was looking at it with an expression she could only describe as exhausted, in a way that had nothing to do with the leukemia. She did her check-in quietly. She was learning to be quiet in ways that weren't the same as being invisible. She wasn't invisible to him. She'd accepted that too. He tracked her presence with a consistency that she'd given up calling unsettling, but that respected the particular quality of the silence he was keeping. She was refilling the water pitcher when he said, "Do you ever think about what you'd do if none of it worked?" She set the pitcher down. "Specify?" "The treatment. If the treatment doesn't work, if this is all just delaying." He was still looking at the window. "What would you tell a patient in that situation?" "I'd tell them what was true," she said. "Which is?" "That there's still time. That time still means something, regardless of how much of it you have. That what you do with the time in front of you isn't nothing just because there's less of it than you wanted." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a nurse's answer," he said. "I'm a nurse." "What's the human answer?" Sophia came and stood beside the window, not too close, just within the edge of the lamplight, looking out at the same city he was looking at. Miami at night was something she'd grown up with, the particular way it glittered over the bay, the blue-white of the cruise ship lights in the distance, the amber glow of the causeways. "The human answer," she said, "is that I think most people are terrified of dying and even more terrified of the time before dying, because at least dying is over and the time before isn't. It just keeps going. And the question of what to do with it is the hardest question there is. And what do people do with it? Some of them make peace with things they'd been avoiding. Some of them don't. Some of them spend the time trying to hold on to everything they've built, and some of them let go of it, and look at what's left when you do. She paused. The ones who let go usually seem, I don't know, not happier, but more present. Marco turned his head and looked at her. She kept looking at the window. "Is that what you're doing?" he said, "encouraging me to let go?" "I'm answering your question," she said. "I don't have an agenda with you." "Everyone has an agenda with me." "Then I must be a novel experience." He made the sound that might have been amusement, and turned back to the window, and they stood there for a while, her standing, him sitting, the city below them going on with its complicated, indifferent life, in a silence that had changed its quality from all the silences before it. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else, something she didn't have a word for yet. After a while, she said, "You should get some rest before the morning infusion." "I know." "Are you going to?" "Probably not." She went to her station. He stayed at the window. She watched him out of her peripheral vision for the next 2 hours while the city below slowly dimmed, and she wrote her notes and tried not to think about the fact that she was starting to know the specific quality of this man's silences, the way you know the silences of people who matter to you. The night he told her about Palermo was the night in week 6 when the treatment hit its lowest point. She'd known it was coming. Dr. Rinaldi's notes, the blood work, the nadir of the cycle. By 2 a.m., he was flat on his back with his eyes closed, and she was doing everything she was supposed to do. Managing the nausea, monitoring the line, adjusting, watching, waiting. And she was doing it automatically, competently, her hands steady, and her brain in the precise, focused place she went when things were bad and she needed to be at her best. But somewhere around 3, when the worst had passed and the room was quiet and he was lying still with his eyes half open, he said, in a voice that was stripped down to its bones, "I used to watch the harbour from my grandmother's house in Palermo. There was a hill. You could see everything from it." She said nothing. She knew by now that she didn't have to. "I haven't been back in 20 years, he said. "I tell myself I'm going to go back. I haven't." "Why not?" A long pause. "Because going back means admitting something about the going forward." He closed his eyes fully. "And I've been very good at going forward." She logged his most recent vitals. She adjusted his blanket. He'd kicked it partly off, and the room was cool. She did these things without thinking about them, and while she did them, she was thinking about hills above harbours, and the specific quality of someone saying, "I haven't been back," like it was a wound that had never quite healed. "Is there still a house?" she said. He opened his eyes. "What?" "On the hill, in Palermo. Is there still a house?" He looked at her for a long moment, and then, "Yes, it's mine. I've owned it for 15 years, and I've never slept in it." She absorbed this. She looked at him, at the pale, gaunt face of a man who owned a house in Palermo that he'd never slept in, who ran an empire from a hospital room, who watched Miami out of a window at 3 in the morning and quoted Dumas in Italian, and went still when she looked at him directly, and sometimes, in the stripped-back honesty of the worst nights, said things that were more nakedly true than anything she'd heard in a long time. "You should sleep," she said. Sophia. It was the first time he'd used her first name. She registered it in her chest before she registered it in her brain, which was exactly the kind of thing she'd been trying to prevent. "What?" she said. "Thank you," he said, "for being good at this." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about saying, "It's my job." She thought about saying, "You don't need to thank me." She thought about saying a great many things that were true and appropriate and professionally measured. "Get some sleep," she said, and turned off the bedside lamp and sat in the dark and listened to him breathe until the breathing slowed and steadied, and told herself the warmth in her chest was just the body maintaining its temperature in a cool room. She stopped believing it sometime around dawn. She found out about her father on a Thursday. It didn't happen the way she might have imagined if she'd allowed herself to imagine it, which she had not, because thinking about it had always been a kind of falling, and she'd learned to keep her feet on the ground. It happened like this. She was going through the patient records, Marco's secondary documents, his earlier medical history, the years of health records Dr. Rinaldi had assembled from various physicians across 2 continents, and she came across a reference. Just a reference, 2 words in the middle of a document that should have been entirely about blood panels and genetic markers, a name that had no business being there. Reyes. Augusto. The room went sideways. She sat very still. The chart was on the tablet in her lap, and she could feel the tablet against her legs and the chair under her and the floor beneath that. And she focused on those physical things while the room did what it was doing, and then slowly didn't. She read the reference again. Reyes, Augusto. Overtown Operation 05. And then a case number, just a case number, in a document that clearly referenced a larger file she didn't have access to. But she knew the name. She knew the year. She knew what Overtown Operation meant in the context of a document in Marco Esposito's medical file, which was, it wasn't medical. It was operational. It was from his other life. The one that lived outside the hospital room, the one that had been running parallel to everything happening in this room for 8 weeks. And her father's name was in it. She closed the file. She set the tablet on the station counter. She stood up and walked to the window, his window, the big one that looked out over the bay, and she looked at the water, which was steady and blue and honest. And she breathed. Augusto Reyes. Her father, who had died when she was 8 years old, who had been found in the canal by the I-95 overpass with a single gunshot wound to the back of his head, whose case had been listed as unsolved by Miami-Dade homicide for 22 years, who her mother had refused to discuss for the last 15 years of her life, who Sophia had mostly not allowed herself to think about, because thinking about him was the falling, and she needed to keep her feet on the ground. She looked at the water and breathed. And then she went back to her station and waited, with the particular patience that she had spent a lifetime developing, for the moment when it would be the right time to find out the rest. She didn't find it by looking. She found it because Marco sent for a file 2 weeks later, or rather sent word through the guards for a courier to deliver a specific document from an off-site location, and the courier brought a large manila envelope and when Marco opened it at his desk, Sophia was at her station close enough to see, without trying to, the corner of a photograph that slid partway out. The photograph showed a man she didn't recognize, 50, 60s, grey-haired, and below it, on the sheet that came out with it before Marco turned it over, a list of names. Reyes Augusto was the third item on the list. She looked away. Her hands did not shake. The monitors continued beeping their small, steady rhythms, and the city continued existing outside the window, and Marco continued reviewing his document with the focused attention he brought to everything. And Sophia sat at her station and understood that the thing she had been trying to outrun her entire adult life had been in this room with her for 8 weeks. She held herself very still and thought with great clarity, "I need to know." Not here, not today, not in a way that could be attributed to anything other than a choice she made with her eyes open. She needed to know the truth, all of it. And she needed to know it from him. The question was whether she could get it without destroying herself in the process of asking. She came back on the night shift with a plan. The plan was, she would be professional. She would do her job. She would be the version of herself she had trained herself into, competent, controlled, steady, the person who didn't fall. And at some point in the long architecture of the night, when the room was quiet and the guards had rotated, and it was just the two of them and the city and the honest grammar of 3 a.m., she would ask. What she hadn't planned for was finding the medication reconciliation file that changed everything first. She found it while doing her usual end-of-week chart audit, the kind of paperwork she did methodically and without drama. She found it in the subfolder of Dr. Rinaldi's treatment notes, in the section marked Alternative Modalities. And what she found was this: a treatment plan. An experimental protocol, CAR T-cell therapy, combined with a specific kinase inhibitor that had been showing remarkable results in AML cases with Marco's specific genetic markers. The clinical trial was running out of Johns Hopkins. The eligibility window was, she checked twice, still open. 3 months of data had come back from a pilot study, and the results were, for patients with his profile, significantly better than standard induction therapy. Dr. Rinaldi had flagged it, had reviewed it, had written a single note in the margin of his summary, "Not appropriate for this patient at this time," and then had done nothing with it. Sophia sat with that for a long time. She pulled Dr. Rinaldi's notes from the past 6 weeks and read them with the attention she brought to things that mattered, which was considerable. She ran the blood work numbers against the protocol's eligibility criteria. She looked at the timeline, the documented reviews, the paper trail of decisions made and not made. And then she looked at something else, something she'd noticed weeks ago and filed away without understanding. A phone number in Dr. Rinaldi's personal log that appeared twice a week, regular as a medication schedule, in the hours when Marco was asleep and the floor was quiet. She didn't know whose number it was. She didn't need to. Not tonight. What she knew was what the medical evidence told her, and the medical evidence told her something that made the back of her neck cold. The treatment that might save Marco Esposito had been sitting in his file for 6 weeks, and his physician had done nothing about it. She thought about that. She thought about the people who wanted Marco dead. She thought about power and succession and the things that happened inside organizations like his when a leader was weakened. She thought about how much easier it would be if he simply didn't survive his own treatment. She sat with the evidence in front of her, and she thought about a man at his window at 3 in the morning talking about a hill above a harbour in Palermo. And she made a decision. She would tell him. But first, she had something to ask him. She chose her moment with the precision she used for everything. 3 in the morning. The floor was on its night rotation. Single guard outside the door, monitors quiet, the city below at its lowest ebb of activity. She'd been on shift since 10. She'd done everything she needed to do. She'd been very steady. She picked up the syringe, a routine one, his 3 a.m. antiemetic, the one she'd drawn up at the medication cart 10 minutes ago. She walked to his bedside. He was awake. Of course he was awake. Marco Esposito apparently never fully slept. He simply moved between levels of consciousness the way water moved between states, and right now he was in the state of lying very still, with his eyes half open and his face turned toward the window. He turned when she approached, looked at the syringe. "Antiemetic," she said. "I know." But he didn't move his arm toward her, which was their usual signal for go ahead. He was looking at her face. "What's wrong?" "Nothing is wrong." "Something is wrong. I can tell." He said it matter-of-factly, not as a challenge. "You hold your shoulders differently when something is wrong. They come up 1/2 centimetre. Very controlled. Most people wouldn't notice." She stared at him. 8 weeks, and he had catalogued the 1/2 centimetre rise of her shoulders. She didn't know why this surprised her, and then she did. Because it meant he'd been paying attention. Not to the clinical facts of her, to her. She set the syringe down on the bedside table. "I need to ask you something," she said. He looked at her in that steady, careful way. "All right. And I need you to tell me the truth." A pause. "I don't make blanket commitments." "Then I need you to tell me the truth about this one specific thing. And I need you to understand that however you answer it, I'm still going to do my job. I'm not going to—" She steadied her voice. "I'm not going to do anything other than ask and listen. But I need to know." He was fully awake now, whatever partial sleep he'd been in entirely gone. He was looking at her with complete attention. "Augusto Reyes," she said. The room went still. She watched his face. She was very good at watching faces, and what she saw in his was something she hadn't fully anticipated. Not surprise, not the specific micro-expression of a man caught out. Something older. Something that looked like a man who had been waiting, for a long time, to be asked a question he'd always known was coming. "He was my father," she said. The silence stretched. "I know," he said. 2 words, and the ground moved beneath her feet. "You knew?" She kept her voice even. She was very proud of how even her voice was. "You knew who I was when I walked in that first day, when Dr. Vasquez said my name." "Not immediately," he said. "I suspected. I was certain by the 2nd day." "And you didn't request a different nurse? You didn't—" "No." "Why not?" He looked at the window, then back at her. "Because it seemed like something that should happen. Something that was owed." He said it simply, without seeking absolution in the simplicity. "Sit down, Sophia." She didn't move. "Tell me." He told her. Not like someone confessing, not with the performance of remorse that would have been easier to process. He told her the way she imagined he did most things, directly, with the particular clarity of a man who had always understood the cost of decisions and had learned to bear it rather than avoid looking at it. He told her that Augusto Reyes had worked for his organization, not in the criminal infrastructure, but on its edges. Car mechanic. The shop in Overtown where Marco's drivers brought the fleet vehicles for service. Her father had been honest, had been careful, had been, by all accounts, a man who wanted only to do his work and go home to his family. He told her that in 2005 there had been an internal crisis, a federal informant buried in the organization, a leak that had cost them 3 operations and 2 men. The investigation had moved fast, in the frantic, brutal way internal investigations moved when the stakes were high enough. He told her that the suspicion had fallen on her father and that the evidence, he said this looking directly at her, not away from it, the evidence had been circumstantial, assembled by men who were frightened and wanted the leak to be found quickly, and that in the speed and the fear and the pressure, not all of it had been properly examined. He told her that by the time he'd understood the full picture, not the version assembled by frightened men, but the actual picture, it had already been done. He didn't inform, she said. Her voice was perfectly level. She wasn't surprised. Not exactly. She'd known her father, had known him in the brief, bright 8 years she'd had with him, but there was something about hearing it confirmed that was different from knowing it. No, Marco said. He didn't. So he was killed for nothing. The words fell into the room and stayed there. Yes, Marco said. He didn't look away. He didn't soften it. Yes. She stood at his bedside in the 3 a.m. quiet, and she held all of it, all 22 years of it, and she looked at this man who had been 20 years old and newly arrived and building his empire and had signed an order that took her father away and taken everything away from her mother and left a child standing in a doorway, listening to a sound she would never unhear. She looked at him, and he looked back at her, and he did not beg, and did not defend himself, and did not, she realized, look away. He looked at her and waited, in the way she imagined he would face anything he had decided to accept. She picked up the syringe from the bedside table. His eyes tracked the movement. He still didn't look away. She administered the antiemetic into his IV line. I need to hear the rest of it, she said. All of it. Whatever comes after the part you just told me. He reached, slowly, without drama, to the drawer of his bedside table. He opened it and removed a manila envelope, thick and slightly worn at the edges, as though it had been handled many times over many years. He held it out to her. She took it. She opened it. Inside, receipts. Dozens of them. Decades of them, the earliest yellowed with age, the most recent crisp and white. She looked at the amounts, the dates, the account numbers. It took her a moment to understand. Then she understood. Scholarships. Anonymous scholarships, deposited into an account in her name from the time she was 8 years old through her graduation from nursing school, every year, without fail. The tuition, she said, hearing her own voice from a distance, and the books, and the apartment when your mother couldn't cover it, and the exam fees. He said it with no expectation of credit, as though listing facts about the weather. The nursing school, the specific one you chose. I made a donation to their scholarship fund that year, but the one in your name had already been set up for 5 years before that. She held the envelope and looked at the receipts, and thought about all the years of working and striving and telling herself she'd done it on her own, that she'd built herself up from Overtown by her own force and intelligence and refusal to fall. And she had. She had done all of those things. The money hadn't taken any of it away. But she hadn't done it alone. Not entirely. "I can't give your father back," Marco said. "I know that. Nothing I can do changes that. The scholarship—" He paused. "It was the only thing I could do. It wasn't enough. I know it wasn't enough." She stood there with the envelope in her hands for a very long time. Then she put the receipts back inside it. She set it on the bedside table between them. "I'm not going to thank you," she said. "I'm not asking you to. And I'm not going to forgive you tonight. I know. But I'm also not going to—" She stopped, started again. "I'm going to think about this. I'm going to think about all of it. And I'm going to keep doing my job. Because whatever else is true about this situation, you're still a patient and I'm still a nurse. And that relationship doesn't change because of everything else." He looked at her, carefully, with something in his eyes she couldn't name, but that made her chest ache with a pressure she hadn't budgeted for, and said, "All right. And tomorrow," she said, "I need to show you something about your treatment. Something that can't wait." Something shifted in his expression, a professional sharpening, the mind that ran enterprises, turning its attention to a new variable. "What about it?" "Tomorrow," she said. "Tonight you need to sleep." She picked up the envelope and put it back in his bedside drawer. She turned the light down and went to her station and sat in the dark and breathed, very carefully and deliberately, for a very long time. Outside the window, the city was dark and sleeping, and it didn't have any answers, and she hadn't expected it to. She spent the following morning building a case. It was what she knew how to do: assemble evidence, cross-reference, verify, construct a picture from disparate data points with the methodical patience she'd developed in 3 years of emergency medicine, where a misread chart or a missed indicator could cost someone their life. She worked at the nurse's station while Marco slept. He'd actually slept, which she considered a small mercy, and also evidence that the conversation the night before had done something to the tension that had been building in him for weeks. And she worked with the particular focus of someone who understands the stakes. The picture that assembled itself was not comfortable. Dr. Lorenzo Rinaldi had been Marco's personal physician for 9 years. His credentials were impeccable. Harvard Medical School, fellowship in oncology and hematology at MD Anderson, board certifications in both, 3 published papers, and a reputation in private medicine circles as the best you could get if you could afford to pay for the best. The treatment decision, or rather the non-decision, was documented in his notes as a judgment call. Alternative protocol reviewed, not clinically appropriate for this patient. No reasoning, no comparison of outcomes, no consultation note from another specialist. Sophia had pulled the clinical trial data herself. She had a friend at Johns Hopkins. They'd done their boards at the same time, had studied together in the brutal final weeks, had maintained the kind of friendship that survived distance because it was built on real respect. She'd texted her friend at 6 in the morning with the genetic markers and the presenting data carefully anonymized and received a call back at 8:30. "Where did you get this case?" her friend said, and she could hear the particular quality of excitement that oncologists got when a puzzle clicked into place. "Private patient. I can't give you details." This is a textbook CAR-T candidate, Sophia. This specific mutation profile. There's a trial at Hopkins right now. The preliminary data is extraordinary. I'd have this patient enrolled yesterday. What would exclude them from the trial? Age over 70, prior cardiac events, active secondary infection, otherwise, a pause. There's really nothing here that would disqualify. Who's been advising this patient? Private physician. I have his notes indicating he reviewed the trial and declined to recommend it. On what basis? Unspecified judgment. A long silence on the line. Sophia, her friend said carefully, is this a situation I need to ask you more questions about? No, Sophia said. I just needed a second opinion on the clinical picture. Well, my second opinion is that whoever is advising this patient should have recommended this trial 6 weeks ago, and the fact that they didn't warrants a serious review. She thanked her friend and hung up and sat for a moment, looking at the evidence in front of her. She thought about patterns. She thought about who benefits from Marco's death. She thought about Nico, the man with the heavy shoulders who had appeared and disappeared in the 4th week, speaking rapid Italian that Marco had answered with a voice like a closed door. She thought about the regular phone number in Dr. Rinaldi's log, appearing twice a week during night hours. She didn't have proof of the thing she suspected. What she had was a clinical gap so large it required explanation, and an absence of documentation for that explanation, and a pattern of timing that was hard to interpret as coincidence. It was enough. She assembled it into a clear, precise document. Clinical findings, comparison data, the trial eligibility analysis, the documented decision and its absence of rationale. And she clipped it together with the printouts from the Hopkins trial and the anonymized blood work comparison, and she waited for Marco to wake up. He woke at 11, which was late for him. She heard the shift in his breathing from her station. She'd learned this, too, the specific change in his breathing that signaled the move from sleep to wakefulness, and gave him 5 minutes before she went in for his morning assessment. He was sitting up, looking at his phone. He looked, she observed this clinically, automatically, better than yesterday. The rest had done something. There was more colour in his face, and the particular tightness around his eyes that she associated with pain he wasn't disclosing had eased slightly. He looked up when she came in. They looked at each other. 8 weeks of shared space had built a vocabulary between them that had very few words in it. Just the economy of 2 people who had spent enough time in a room together to stop needing to negotiate every gesture. She did his assessment, and he cooperated, and neither of them said anything about the night before, which she was grateful for, and which she suspected was deliberate on his part. When she was done, she picked up the document she'd assembled. "I need to show you something," she said. She laid it on the bed in front of him. She stood back and let him read. He read the way he did everything, thoroughly, without rushing, going through each page with the attention of someone who understood that information was power, and power was everything. She watched his face while he read. She watched the precise moment, about halfway through the 2nd page, when his expression changed. It was a small change. Marco's face didn't do large things in moments of significance. She'd noticed this. The bigger the thing, the smaller the visible response. But she could read him now, at 8 weeks in. Not perfectly, not completely, but more than she'd thought possible 2 months ago. And she could see what was happening underneath the controlled surface. He understood what he was looking at. He read to the end. He set the document down on his lap. He looked at the middle distance for a moment, and she could almost see the process happening, the information being categorized, cross-referenced with things she didn't have access to, assembled into a shape that made sense to him. "Rinaldi," he said finally. "Just the name." "The clinical gap is documented," she said. "The trial eligibility is clear. I had a colleague at Johns Hopkins confirm the picture independently, without identifying details. She described you as a textbook candidate." A pause. "The decision to not recommend the trial is not documented with any clinical rationale." "It's not a clinical decision," he said. "No," she agreed. "I don't think it is." He looked at the document for another moment. Then he looked at her. "You understand," he said, "what it means that you've brought this to me instead of the other options." "I understand what my options were," she said. "I chose this one." "Why?" She thought about it. She could give him the professional answer, because he's my patient and I have an obligation to his care. She could give him the measured answer, because the evidence indicates a treatment that hasn't been offered, and it's my job to advocate for treatment options. Both were true. "Because," she said, "you're not allowed to give up before you've tried everything." The room was very quiet. "And this is everything?" he said. "This is something that hasn't been tried. It might not work. The trial is still a trial. But the data is—" She breathed. "It's real, Marco. And it was in your file 6 weeks ago, and someone decided you shouldn't have access to it." He looked at the document in his lap. For the first time in 8 weeks he looked not broken. Marco Esposito would not break, she understood that now, but something she hadn't seen him be before. He looked like a man who had, for once in his life, run out of moves. And then he looked up at her, and he nodded. One nod, small and absolute. "Make the call," he said. Sophia picked up her phone and called the number at Johns Hopkins, and began, with the precise and methodical competence of someone who understood that some things could not be undone, but some things could, to try to change the outcome. The week after Sophia brought him the treatment documents was the week Marco dismantled a 9-year professional relationship in 48 hours. She watched it happen from the periphery. She wasn't part of it, wasn't meant to be. But the 13th floor had a particular intimacy, and the walls were good, but not that good. And she was very good at listening to things that weren't said directly. Dr. Rinaldi came for his morning rounds on the Thursday and did not leave afterward the way he usually did. The conversation behind Marco's door lasted 27 minutes. When it ended, Rinaldi walked to the elevator with a face that had gone a specific shade of grey and never came back. Dr. Vasquez appeared 2 hours later with a temporary specialist, a Dr. Marcus Webb, imported from the MD Anderson outpost in Coral Gables, whose reputation in AML was apparently significant enough that Marco had accepted the replacement without visible objection. "How did you know?" Sophia asked Dr. Vasquez at the nurses' station, quietly, while Webb was reviewing the charts. Dr. Vasquez looked at her for a measured moment. "He told me what you found, and how you found it." A pause. "You took a risk going directly to him." "I went through the appropriate channels first," Sophia said, which was not entirely true. She'd gone to her friend at Hopkins, which was not a channel exactly, but was the fastest way to get the independent clinical verification she needed before bringing anything forward. Dr. Vasquez's expression suggested she understood the not-entireness of this. "Regardless, you did the right thing." She looked back at the chart. "Dr. Webb will handle the Hopkins trial enrollment. Given the timeline, we can begin preparation next week." "And Rinaldi?" A very small pause. Dr. Rinaldi has chosen to retire from private practice. The tone said everything the words didn't. Effective immediately. Sophia thought about this. She thought about what chosen meant in a context where the alternative to choosing was something she didn't want to examine too closely. She thought about Marco in his chair the night before the confrontation, quieter than usual, more internal, and about the particular quality of his silence that meant he was not the version of himself who watched the city from a window, but the other version, the one that had built things and held things and defended them. "All right," she said, and went back to work. Marco called her into his room at 7 that evening, which was not an unusual hour for a check-in. What was unusual was that he wasn't in the bed or the chair by the window. He was at his desk, in a dark suit jacket that one of the guards must have brought him, sitting upright with the posture of a man who was going to work rather than receive care. He'd lost weight since the beginning. The treatment had taken what the disease had started, but sitting like this, with the monitors quiet beside him, and the city glowing behind him, and his face in three-quarter shadow, he looked more like the photographs she'd seen of him, and less like the patient she'd been managing for 2 months. It was briefly disorienting. "Sit down," he said, and gestured to the chair across the desk. She sat. He looked at her across the desk, the way she imagined he looked at people in professional contexts, not unkindly, but with the full weight of his attention, which was considerable. "I want to tell you what Rinaldi was doing." "You don't have to." "I want to." He rested his forearms on the desk. "The people in my organization, the people who've known I'm ill, there are factions. There have always been factions. A man in my position creates them just by existing, because everyone around him is calculating what the world looks like without him." He said this without bitterness, just the matter-of-fact recognition of someone who had accepted the arithmetic of power. Rinaldi was being paid by one of those factions to ensure that my treatment was managed in a particular direction. "To ensure you didn't survive," Sophia said. "To ensure I didn't recover fully. There's a difference." He held up one finger. "A man who dies suddenly is a problem. A man who declines slowly and loses his capacity to function, that is an opportunity. The organization continues to run. Power transitions gradually. By the time it's done, it looks natural." She absorbed this. "And Dr. Webb?" "Dr. Webb has no connection to anyone in my organization. I verified this personally." A slight pause. "Through means that I'll spare you the details of." "Appreciated." A brief silence. He looked at the desk for a moment. "You could have done other things with what you found," he said. "You could have brought it to hospital administration. You could have gone to medical licensing. You could have—" He glanced up. "You could have simply decided that the outcome Rinaldi was engineering was the outcome you preferred." The room was very quiet. "I told you," Sophia said, "I don't have an agenda with you. After what I told you about your father, after what you told me about my father," she confirmed, "because my father—" She stopped, steadied. "My father was a good man, and what happened to him was wrong. And the fact that it was wrong doesn't mean that wrong is the answer to wrong." She looked at Marco directly. "I'm not naive enough to think you're a good person, Marco. I know what you are. I know the kind of decisions you've made and the kind of things you've ordered. What happened to my father isn't the only thing. It's just the one that's mine." He listened to this without moving. "But I am a nurse," she continued, "and you are my patient. And the medical evidence told me there was a treatment that you hadn't been offered that might keep you alive. And it is not my job or my right or my—" She stopped again. Her voice was very steady, and she was working to keep it that way. "It is not my place to decide that you don't deserve to live because of who you are. That's not how medicine works, and it's not how I work." Marco looked at her for a long time after she finished. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay? I just wanted to understand your reasoning." He leaned back in the chair slightly. "I've been trying to understand it for 2 months." "And now you do?" "And now I do." A pause. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just get into the trial and do what Dr. Webb tells you." Something moved through his expression, something that had been moving through his expression with increasing frequency over the past weeks, something she still didn't have a name for, but was beginning to suspect was the emotional equivalent of whatever happened to ice when the temperature shifts. "Sophia," he said. "What? I should have been—" He stopped. This was unusual. He didn't usually stop mid-sentence. "I should have verified the evidence in 2005 more carefully, before the order was given. That's not an excuse, but I want you to know that I know that." She looked at him, at the man who had built an empire and lost something in the building of it. Not just her father, she thought, but pieces of himself, the accumulating cost of choices made quickly in frightened rooms. "I know you know," she said. "I could tell you knew it the night you told me." He nodded once and looked at the desk, and she stood up and went back to her station, and the city did its usual, indifferent glittering outside the window, and neither of them said anything else that night. They began transitioning to the Hopkins trial protocol on a Monday, and the week that followed was the most difficult of the entire treatment so far. Not medically, though there were difficult medical components, the bridging chemotherapy required to prepare for the CAR-T infusion, the days of nausea that were worse than before, the fever on the Wednesday night that kept Sophia on her feet until 3 in the morning, but in a different way, a quieter way, that she didn't have a clinical framework for. Something had changed in the room. She'd noticed it starting in the days after Marco told her about her father. The conversation had done something to the space between them. Not eliminated the distance exactly, not crossed it, but altered its quality. Like the difference between a wall and a window. Still a barrier, but you could see through it. She was more careful now, which was the professional thing to be, and less careful in other ways, which was not. On the Thursday of the bad week, when his temperature was running at 38.8 and the antiemetics weren't working well, and he'd been on his back for 6 hours, she sat beside the bed, not at her station, beside the bed, and she talked to him. She talked about small things, about the heat in Miami in October, about how she'd learned to find the breeze off the bay in Overtown when she was small, about the particular quality of light in the city just before a storm. She wasn't sure in the moment whether he was fully conscious or running somewhere between wakefulness and the fever sleep that sometimes took patients at this point in the cycle. But she talked, and his breathing steadied, and the tension in his jaw, always a marker of the pain he didn't disclose, gradually eased. When his temperature broke at midnight and he surfaced back to full wakefulness, he lay for a moment with his eyes on the ceiling. You were talking, he said. Yes. About the bay. Yes. A pause. My grandmother's house in Palermo was above the water. Different water. But the same... He stopped. The same quality of light before a storm. She looked at his face, fever pale, eyes slightly glassy still from the heat of the past hours, but present. There. Whatever there meant for a man who had built himself out of leaving. Tell me about it, she said. He did. He told her about Palermo in a way he hadn't before, not the brief reference she'd gotten that night weeks ago, but something fuller. The hill, the house, the grandmother who had smelled like olive oil and almonds and had taught him to read with one hand and cook with the other, who had told him, and this was the part that caught Sophia, the part that lodged in her chest and stayed, who had told him that the two most important things a man could do were to know what he stood for and to stand for it. She knew what you became, Sophia said. She died before I came to Miami. A pause. She wouldn't have been pleased. But you still kept her principles. He was quiet for a moment. I used them wrong, he said. I knew what I stood for. I stood for the wrong things. He looked at the ceiling. Or the right things for the wrong reasons. She thought about this. She thought about a 19-year-old arriving in Miami with a grandmother's two principles and a set of skills that Miami only wanted one of, and about 23 years of building something that was, from the outside, power, and was, from the inside of this room at 1 in the morning, something more complicated and more sad than power. She didn't say any of that. But she stayed in the chair beside the bed, and after a while his breathing slowed again. Real sleep this time, not fever sleep, and she sat with him in the quiet of the room and looked out at the city and thought about standing for things. The question arose, as questions she hadn't expected always seemed to arise on the 13th floor, obliquely. It was the Saturday of the following week. His numbers were stabilizing. Dr. Webb was cautiously optimistic in the methodical, evidence-based way of oncologists who had learned to be careful with hope. Marco was sitting up for the first time in 3 days, drinking coffee his chef had sent up, reading the portfolio with something approaching his usual focus. She was at her station. She'd been thinking about Overtown, which she did sometimes, not with the pain of the early years, but with a kind of archaeological attention, the way you look at the place you're from when you've been away from it long enough to see it clearly. Sophia? She looked up. He was watching her from the bed, with an expression she'd catalogued carefully over the past months, and still wasn't entirely sure how to classify. Attention? Interest? Something that had deepened below both those words into something with more gravity. What will you do after this? He said. After the treatment, when this floor goes back to being storage. She considered the question. Go back to the ER, probably, or find another oncology position. I have options. Where? In Miami? Maybe elsewhere. She looked at him. Why? He looked at the window. The city was doing its afternoon thing, hot and blue and indifferent, the water of the bay catching the light. I've been thinking about Palermo, he said, about going back. She didn't say anything. The trial is 6 months, he said. Hopkins will manage most of it remotely, with local clinical support. It doesn't have to happen here. No, she agreed, it doesn't. He turned from the window and looked at her. Would you consider going somewhere else, he said, for work? The question was as precisely controlled as everything he did, and as careful, and about 14 times more than what it appeared to be on its surface, and she recognized all of that, and still felt the impact of it somewhere central in her chest. "That depends," she said very carefully, "on what the situation would be." He looked at her for a long moment. "I haven't figured that out yet," he said. "I'm—" A very small pause. "This is new to me." "What is?" "Not knowing the answer before I ask the question." She looked at him. He looked back at her. The city between them and below them did its usual thing, and neither of them acknowledged it. "Get through the trial first," she said. "Then we'll talk about the situation." He nodded. He picked up his coffee. He went back to his portfolio. But there was something different in the room. Something that had been growing in the spaces between conversations and silences and 3 a.m. honesty, and stayed now like heat from a source that didn't go away when you turned from it. She went back to her tablet and pretended to read, and tried to manage the warmth in her chest with the same professional precision she applied to everything else. She was less successful than usual. The attack came on a Wednesday in December. Sophia knew it was December because she'd been thinking earlier that morning about how the light had changed, the way it always did in Miami in winter, not cold, but different, the angle shifting to something more golden, less direct. She'd been thinking about light, and then she was on the floor, and everything became very different. It happened fast. That was the thing about violence. She'd learned this in the ER, in the aftermath of violence, in the bodies and the accounts. It happened fast. And then the slow part came after. And the slow part was worse. She heard the elevator. She heard the doors. She heard something that was not the sound of the guard's footsteps, because she'd learnt the sound of those, their specific weight and rhythm, the way they shifted from the day guard to the night rotation. This was different. More footsteps, and then voices, too many, and then the sound she hadn't heard before, but recognized immediately from somewhere below conscious understanding. Gunfire. The door to Marco's room was closed. She had been at the nurse's station doing her end-of-shift charting, and was on her feet before the first shot fully registered. The corridor was, she assessed it in the 1 second she had before everything accelerated, occupied by people who should not have been there. 3 of them at minimum, coming from the elevator end. The door to the patient room on the opposite side of the corridor, a secondary patient, a minor procedure recovery, a young man named Daniel who had been resting and who absolutely should not become collateral damage, was open. She moved. She reached the doorway in 3 steps and put herself in it, pushing Daniel back and down, and the thing that hit her wasn't a bullet. She understood this later, after everything, when she had time to understand things. It was a man's body, weight and momentum, because someone had swung something, because there was a struggle in the corridor that she had not fully accounted for. And her left shoulder and side hit the door frame at an angle that sent white light across her vision and took her off her feet. She did not lose consciousness. She was very clear on this later. She did not lose consciousness. She stayed on the floor in the doorway of Daniel's room, and she was aware of the corridor and aware of Daniel behind her saying, "Oh God, in a loop, and aware of the sound of things happening in the corridor that she was not watching because she'd been trained to stay low and stay still in situations she couldn't control. And then she was aware of a different kind of silence. Marco had heard the elevator. He had heard the elevator because he had been trained, a long time ago, in a version of himself that was less tired and not ill, to hear the specific sounds that were wrong in any environment he was in. And the elevator at this hour, with this number of people in it, was wrong. He had been out of the bed before the first sound. There was a gun in the bedside table. He had not mentioned this to Sophia. She probably knew it was there. She went through his drawers sometimes during routine checks, and she was not a woman who missed things. But neither of them had mentioned it, which was its own kind of agreement. He had the gun in his hand when the door opened, and the man who came through it was not one of the regular rotation, and Marco had made a great many decisions in his life at speed, and made another one now. He took down the man in the doorway. He moved into the corridor. He was aware, at the edge of his awareness, of the figure against the doorframe across the hall, her braid, her blue scrubs, the specific configuration of her body on the floor that seized something in his chest like a hand closing around a fist. He moved faster than he had moved in months. There were two more, who dealt with them with the particular efficiency of a man who had learned these skills young and had not entirely lost them, regardless of what the leukemia had taken. And then the corridor was still, and the guards from the stairwell were coming through. They'd come from below, he understood. The attack had been designed to neutralize the floor guard first, and the corridor was full of people who were on his side of this, and also full of noise and light and the particular chaos of aftermath. He went to her first. He went to her before he checked his own people, before he assessed the situation, before he did any of the things that 23 years of running an empire had trained him to do. He went to her, and he dropped to one knee beside her in the corridor, and he put his hand on her face and said her name. "I'm okay," she said. Her voice was tight. "My shoulder and ribs, I think. Don't—" She grabbed his wrist when he tried to help her up. "Don't move me yet." He stayed still. He kept his hand on her face, and she kept her grip on his wrist, and around them the corridor was sorting itself out, and he didn't move. "You're shaking," she said. He looked at his hand on her face. She was right. His hands, which had held a gun 15 minutes ago without trembling, were shaking. "I know," he said. "Are you—" "I'm fine." He wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about the white light of the corridor and her specific body against the doorframe and the hand that had closed around something in his chest and had not yet let go. "Just stay still." "I am staying still." A small pause, and then, with the characteristic exactness that he had come to understand was simply how she was, "You picked up a gun?" "Yes. For the first time since I decided I was done with it. Yes." He was looking at her face, at the lines of pain around her eyes, at the braid that had come half loose, at the absolute steadiness underneath the pain, which was her in miniature, the exact combination of things that she was. "Don't worry about that now." "I'm making a clinical note," she said, very quietly. "Elevated stress response indicators. Recommend monitoring." Something broke in him. It was not dramatic. Marco Esposito breaking was not a dramatic thing. It was the same as everything he did, small and controlled and visible only if you knew how to look. But it broke, and he recognized what was breaking, and he stayed on his knees beside her in the corridor and didn't move. "You moved in front of that door," he said. "Daniel couldn't have. I know why you did it. I'm not asking for the reason." He looked at her. "I'm telling you that I saw you do it." She looked back at him. Even on the floor, Even with her shoulder wrong and her ribs probably fractured, she looked back at him with the direct and unwavering look she'd been giving him since the first morning, the one that had been making him go still for 3 months. "I know you saw," she said. They stayed there a moment longer, his hand on her face and her grip on his wrist, while the corridor continued to resolve itself around them, and the city below continued to be indifferent, and the night continued to be very long. And then he helped her up, carefully, and the EMTs from the downstairs team were there, and he stayed beside her while they worked, and did not move from her side for the rest of the night. Dawn found him in a chair beside her bed. She'd been moved to a secondary room, her shoulder assessed and braced, 2 cracked ribs wrapped, nothing requiring surgery. Reading. The Monte Cristo, in Italian, the same book he'd been reading the night she'd caught him. She woke at 6 and found him there, and looked at him for a long moment. "You stayed," she said. "Yes." "Why?" He looked up from the book. The Miami morning was coming up through the window, golden and new, the same way it had come up on the first morning she'd stepped off the elevator 3 months ago. "Because I wanted to live," he said. "And I needed to know you were here when I woke up to understand that." She looked at him. He looked at her, and neither of them said anything more, because some things are more accurately conveyed in the silence between 2 people who have stopped pretending they are only what they started as. The week after the attack reorganized everything. The 13th floor's security was overhauled in 48 hours. Different guards, different protocols, an operation that Marco directed from his bed with the same focused efficiency she'd watched him apply to everything else. Except this time, she noticed that he checked on her between every meeting, appearing in the doorway of her temporary room to ask, not quite ask, because asking was not exactly in his vocabulary, but to stand in the doorway with an expression that communicated the question clearly enough, whether she was all right. She was, broadly. The ribs hurt in a way she managed, with the usual clinical pragmatism, and her shoulder was painful, but healing. And she'd been assigned light duties for the week by Dr. Vasquez, who had been characteristically composed about the attack, while also being, Sophia noticed, the most shaken Sophia had ever seen her. "This isn't the job you signed up for," Dr. Vasquez said on the Thursday, sitting across from her at the nurses' station. "No," Sophia agreed. "You could leave. The contract has a force majeure clause. No one would fault you." Sophia thought about this seriously, with the attention it deserved. She thought about Daniel in his room, who had gone home the day after the attack and sent flowers to the nurses' station without knowing who specifically to address them to. She thought about the corridor and the doorframe and her shoulder against it. She thought about a man in a chair at dawn with a book in his hands and the city coming up gold through the window. "I'm not leaving," she said. Dr. Vasquez looked at her for a moment. "I know," she said. And there was something in her voice that was not quite approval and not quite warning, but was in the vicinity of both. Marco dealt with the traitors in the way Sophia didn't ask about and didn't need to be told about, because the information came through in pieces she assembled without seeking. A name mentioned in a phone call, the quality of Marco's voice in 2 conversations she was not a part of, but was peripherally present for. The way the guards changed and the quality of the tension on the floor changed, decreasing in a way that felt like the release of pressure that had been building for a long time. What she did know, directly, was this. He called her into his room on the Friday evening and said, "I'm going to Palermo." She had been waiting for this, in the way she'd learned to wait for things on the 13th floor, not with impatience, but with attention. She set down the chart she'd been reviewing and looked at him. "For the trial continuation," she said. "Yes, Hopkins has a partner institution in Palermo. Dr. Webb has cleared it." He was looking at the window, the habit of weeks. "I'm going to close operations here, hand management to my second. Retire." She absorbed this. "Retire," she said. "I have enough evidence on the faction that orchestrated this to make their lives very complicated. I'm going to use it. And then I'm going to stop." He said it without drama, which was the only way he seemed capable of saying anything. "I've been doing this for 23 years. I'm 42. I have a house in Palermo I've never slept in." A pause. "And it turns out I'd like to." She was quiet. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Ask?" He turned from the window. He looked at her with the full weight of his careful, dark attention, which she'd been receiving for 3 months now and had still not entirely adapted to. "Would you come?" he said. "To Palermo." As... A pause, and she watched him navigate something that was genuinely new for him, the visible work of a man asking something he didn't know the outcome of. "There are medical facilities. There's a clinic that partners with Hopkins. I would need ongoing nursing support through the remainder of the trial." "That's the clinical answer," she said. He held her gaze. "Yes, I'm offering you the clinical answer because the other answer is..." He stopped. "I'm not good at the other answer." "Try," she said. A long pause. Marco Esposito, who had never appeared to struggle with words in the entire 3 months of her knowing him, was visibly struggling. "I want you there," he said finally. "Not as my nurse, or not only as my nurse. I want..." He seemed to be finding the sentence from somewhere new, somewhere that hadn't had much use. "I would like to know what it looks like. The hill above the water. With you there." The room was very quiet. "You're not asking me to be something," she said slowly, feeling out the words. "You're asking me to choose to be there." "Yes. There's a difference. I know. I'm trying to..." The near amusement flickered. "I'm trying to do this correctly. I have little experience with correctly." She looked at him. She thought about Overtown and her father and the envelope of receipts and the syringe she'd set down. She thought about 3 months of the honest grammar of nights. She thought about a hand on her face in a corridor and "I wanted to live," said to a window at dawn. She thought about a hill above the Mediterranean and a house that had been waiting 20 years for someone to sleep in it. "I need to think about it," she said. "Give me a week." He nodded. He didn't push, didn't negotiate, didn't apply any of the pressure that she knew he was capable of applying. He just nodded, which was, she thought, the most persuasive thing he could have done. The week he gave her was both very short and very long. She went through it the way she went through difficult things, methodically, honestly, without letting herself avoid the parts that were hard. She made a list, which was something she did when she was trying to think clearly. Pros and cons, practical and otherwise. She looked at the list, and then she put it away, because it told her the things she already knew, and none of the things she needed to understand. What she needed to understand was whether she was making a choice or being pulled. The distinction mattered to her. It mattered in the specific way that things matter when you've spent your whole life in motion, studying, working, building, always forward, always the next thing, And you've learned the difference between moving towards something and being carried by a current that runs faster than your ability to swim against it. She was not afraid of Marco. She'd been surprised by this over the past months, that the man who carried the weight of the things he'd done, who existed in the world with the particular gravity of someone who had made a great many choices and lived with all of them, did not make her afraid. What he made her was, and she turned this over carefully, the way you turn a stone to see what's underneath, present. More present in a room with him than she'd been in most rooms with most people. That was one thing. The other thing was her father. She had not forgiven Marco. She'd told him that, and it was still true, and she didn't expect it to become untrue in any simple or easy way. Forgiveness, real forgiveness, the kind that meant something, was a long process, and she was at the very beginning of it, and she had no idea where the path went or what it looked like at the end. But she had made a decision, sometime in the week he gave her, that she was not willing to let her father's death be the defining boundary of her life. That choosing to stay in Miami and not go to Palermo because of what happened in 2005 would be letting that old wound make her choices, and she had never let wounds make her choices. She'd made them herself, with her eyes open, for better or worse. She was a nurse who had run toward the difficult thing her whole career. She was a woman who had climbed out of Overtown and built something with her hands and refused to fall. She was not going to stand at the edge of something real and choose the comfortable distance because the alternative was complicated. She also called her friend from Hopkins on the Wednesday of the week and asked about the medical landscape in Palermo. Her friend laughed. "Of course you're going to Italy," she said. "I'm not surprised." "I haven't decided anything." "You've already decided. You're just doing the research." A pause. "The clinical partner in Palermo is excellent. If your patient is continuing the trial, it's a workable situation. And," a hint of something warmer in her voice, "Palermo is extraordinary. You should go for you, regardless of everything else." Sophia thought about this. She thought about it while she finished the week on the 13th floor, doing her job, monitoring Marco's response to the new protocol, which was, Dr. Webb noted with his careful brand of optimism, encouraging, and being in the room with him and saying almost nothing about the decision she was working through. He didn't ask. He was very carefully not asking, which she noted and appreciated, and which was also, she recognized, one of the things that made him what he was to her, someone who understood the value of giving a person space to make their own choice. On the Sunday evening, the last evening of the week he'd given her, she was at her station doing her end-of-shift paperwork when he said from his bed, "Sophia." "I know," she said without looking up. A pause. "You know what?" "I know my answer." She set the tablet down. "I'm coming to Palermo." The silence that followed had a particular quality, the specific, weighted quality of a significant thing landing in a room and being received by a man who had learned, over many years, not to show too much of what he received. "Why?" he said. She looked at him across the room. "Because it's my choice," she said. "Not because you asked me, not because of everything that's happened, because I looked at all of it, including the parts that are hard and the parts I haven't worked through yet, and I decided that I wanted to be there, that I wanted to see what it looks like, the hill above the water." A pause. "With you there." He was quiet for a long moment. Okay, he said, in the voice he used for things that were not small, even when they were said small. Okay, she said, and went back to her paperwork, and the city outside did its usual thing, and the room held something new, warm and quiet, and there. They left Miami on a Thursday morning in January on a private flight out of Opa-locka Executive Airport, which was not the kind of departure most people associated with someone like Marco Esposito. There was no motorcade, no extensive entourage. 2 guards, the ones he trusted, the ones who'd been on the floor since before the attack and had earned their positions through the simple arithmetic of who was still standing after everything was over. Dr. Webb, who would accompany them for the first leg and establish the handover with the Palermo Clinic, and Sophia, who had packed her life into 2 suitcases and a carry-on with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything. She'd given her apartment keys to a friend who was looking for a sublet. She'd transferred her ER credentials and filed her leave documents. She'd had one long phone call with the charge nurse at her previous unit, who had listened to everything Sophia said and then responded, "He must be something." Sophia had thought about this for a moment and said, "He's complicated." That's not a denial, baby. At the airport, Marco was quieter than usual, which was saying something. He moved through the process of boarding, the car, the tarmac, the stairs, with a particular quality of focus, as though he was accounting for something. She watched him from a slight distance, the way she watched everything, and identified what it was in the set of his shoulders and the direction of his gaze. He was looking at the city. Miami, receding. The skyline in the January morning, the bay glittering behind the terminal, the particular blue of the Florida sky that was unlike any other blue in the world. He was looking at it the way you look at something you're leaving. She stood beside him on the tarmac for a moment. "You're really going," she said. Not a question. "Yes." He kept looking at the skyline. "I built everything here. 23 years. I built—" He stopped. It was supposed to be the thing that mattered most. And now? He looked at her. The morning light caught his face at the same angle it had caught it that first morning on the floor, when she'd walked in and he'd been watching the city from his bed, and she'd thought, "He looks like what he is after something has been taken from him." He still looked like that. But the something was different now. The thing that had been taken was the illness and the pretense and the particular version of himself that had been built at the cost of other things. What was left was, she searched for the word, more. Stripped of the performance, he was more than the performance had been. "Now," he said, "I want to know what the rest looks like." She nodded. They boarded the plane. The flight was 9 hours, and she slept for 4 of them, which was a thing she rarely did on planes, and which told her something about where she was in the process of managing this new thing, which was, she was tired of managing it, and she was instead simply being in it. She woke to find Marco awake across the aisle, reading. The cabin was quiet. The guards were in the rear section. Dr. Webb was asleep. The attendant was visible through the galley curtain. Marco looked up when she shifted. In the low light of the cabin, with the Atlantic outside the windows, and Italy still several hours away, he looked not young, not innocent, not any of the soft things that would have been wrong for him. He looked at rest, in a way she had not seen in 3 months in the hospital room, as though the altitude and the distance from Miami had removed something he'd been carrying, or loosened it, the way a knot loosens when tension is released. "You were asleep," he said. "I know. I'm awake now." She stretched carefully. The ribs were almost healed, the shoulder better. "What are you reading?" He held up the book, a different one this time, Lampedusa, the Leopard, in Italian. "Appropriate," she said. "I thought so." He set it down on his knee. "When we arrive," he paused, "I want to warn you. The house has been managed by a caretaker. It will need—" Another pause, and she understood he was navigating something that was not entirely practical. "It may need work." "Most things do," she said. He looked at her. "We'll figure it out," she said. "That's what you do with things that need work." The light outside the windows was changing. The pale, flat light of mid-ocean, still dark toward the east where Italy waited. They would see the coast of Sicily in the morning. "Sophia," he said. "What?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the book in his hands. "I don't know how to be this," he said. "This version of things. I know how to be useful to people in specific ways. I know how to manage things and build things and make decisions. I don't know how to—" He gestured, and the gesture encompassed the plain and the Atlantic and the future, which was something neither of them had talked about in specific terms. "Neither do I," she said. "I know how to work. I know how to take care of things. I don't know how to—" She looked out the window at the dark Atlantic. "Let's just go to the house first." He nodded. He picked up his book. They flew east through the night, and the dark water moved below them, and neither of them needed to say anything else. Sicily arrived the way she'd been told it would, and also nothing like she'd been told. The light. She'd heard about the light in Sicily. Everyone who'd been there mentioned it, usually with the slightly dazed expression of someone who had tried to describe a colour they didn't have a word for. She understood it now. It was not warm, not golden, not the tropical brightness of Miami. It was clear, clear in a way that made edges exact and colours honest. A light that had been doing the same thing for thousands of years and had not been in any particular hurry about any of it. They came in over the coast at dawn, the plane banking south over the Tyrrhenian Sea, and Sophia pressed her face to the oval window and watched Sicily come up out of the water. The dark mass of the interior mountains, the long curve of the northern coast, the city of Palermo spreading from the water up into the hills like something that had grown there rather than been built. She felt Marco watching her watch it. "It's real," she said, without turning from the window. "Yes," he said. "In photographs it looks like paintings. I thought it was the filter." "It's not the filter." She turned. He was watching her with the expression she'd stopped trying to classify and had started simply receiving, the one that was careful and deep, and somehow both of those things at once. He was looking at her, looking at his city, and whatever it meant to him to bring her here was visible in that expression in a way that didn't need to be verbalized. The car from the airport wound through Palermo's morning, through streets that were narrow and ancient and alive with the particular energy of a city that had been invaded by everyone and belonged to itself, and up through the residential hills toward the north. And Sophia watched everything with the hungry attention of someone arriving somewhere new that feels inexplicably, not entirely, unfamiliar. The house was at the top of a hill. She'd imagined it, a little, from the way he'd described it, the view, the grandmother's house nearby, Long since gone, he'd told her, but the orientation was the same. The Mediterranean visible beyond the city and the harbour. What she hadn't imagined was the house itself. It was not enormous. That was the first thing. She'd expected, given what he was, the scale of a palazzo, or at least a villa with the proportions of a statement. What she got was a house that was large in a human way, 2 stories of pale stone, with wrought iron balconies and green shutters, and a terrace that opened from the main floor toward the view. It looked like it had been there for 100 years, and planned to be there for 100 more. The caretaker, an elderly man named Giuseppe, who had been managing the property for 15 years, who shook Marco's hand with the particular warmth of old loyalty, and looked at Sophia with the open appraisal of someone who had been waiting to see who Marco Esposito would eventually bring here, had aired the rooms and filled the kitchen with basics and put fresh linen on all the beds. The front door opened onto a tiled entrance hall, cool and dim, smelling of stone and lemon, and something floral she couldn't identify. The rooms beyond were furnished with the restrained good taste of someone who had known how to buy beautiful things and had not overused the knowledge. A long table in the dining room, sofas in a sitting room, a kitchen with a wood-burning stove and copper pans hanging from a rack. On the second floor, the main bedroom had a balcony. The balcony had the view. She stood on it in the morning light and looked at the city below and the harbour beyond it, and the Mediterranean beyond that, flat and ancient and blue, in a way that was not like any blue she'd ever seen before. And she stayed there until she heard Marco behind her. He came out onto the balcony and stood beside her without touching her, the way he'd always maintained a specific distance in the hospital, not cold, not formal, just respectful of something between them that had never been formally negotiated. "You've really never slept here," she said. "Never." She looked at the view. "We're going to fix that." He was quiet for a moment beside her. Then, in a voice that was very quiet and very precise, "Yes, I think we are." Below them, Palermo went on being ancient and beautiful, and the sea went on being the sea, and the light did its extraordinary specific thing, and neither of them moved for a very long time. The 6 months in Palermo were not a love story in the way that love stories usually go, because the people in them were not those kinds of people. They were 2 people who had spent 3 months learning each other in the stripped-back honesty of a hospital room, and who were now in a house above the Mediterranean with 6 months of medical treatment still between them and whatever came after, and who were navigating all of it the way they navigated everything. Carefully, honestly, without a great deal of ceremony. The medical situation structured the time. Marco had appointments at the Palermo clinic 3 times a week, a smaller, quieter version of the Hopkins protocol, managed by a specialist named Dr. Fontana, who reminded Sophia of a more relaxed Dr. Webb, and who seemed, within the first 2 appointments, to have taken the measure of what was happening between his patient and the nurse who accompanied him everywhere, and had decided that it was none of his business, and also excellent for patient motivation. The treatment was working. The numbers, which Sophia had been reading for months with the precise attention of someone who understood what they meant and what they cost, were moving in the right direction. Not quickly, not dramatically. Marco's body was not young and had been through a great deal, and the treatment was demanding, but steadily, in the methodical way that good things sometimes happened, 1 test at a time. She was working too. Dr. Fontana had a practice attached to the clinic that needed a skilled nurse with oncology experience, and the question of whether she spoke Italian had been answered when she'd responded to a patient intake question in Sicilian dialect. which she'd picked up with alarming speed in the first 3 weeks. And Dr. Fontana had hired her on the spot with the enthusiasm of someone who had needed her before she arrived. So the days developed their own shape. She went to the clinic in the mornings at 8, walking the hill to the clinic with the particular pleasure of someone who had spent years in a car or a bus or a hospital elevator and was now in a place where walking was possible and worth doing. She came back at noon, or at 1, or at 2, depending on the day's cases. She brought food from the market sometimes, the market at Ballarò, which was one of the wonders of the world, all raw colour and noise, and the specific smell of citrus and fish and spice. And she cooked, which was something she hadn't done in years and discovered she'd missed. Marco worked. She'd known he would. Had known that retirement for a man like him would not mean inactivity, but would mean something different. The transfer of focus from an empire to something smaller and more selected. He was consulting. He was managing investments, the legitimate ones, which were more extensive than she'd realized, and he was, slowly, beginning to make choices about the version of himself that came after everything else. In the evenings, they were in the house together. This was the part she had not had a template for, and the part that turned out to be the most defining. They cooked together, sometimes. More accurately, she cooked, and he was in the kitchen, being in her way, with the specific quality of someone who was trying not to be in the way, but was interested in everything she was doing. He learned gradually. She taught him things about cooking that his chef had apparently never offered to teach him, because his chef was too professional to let him near the stove, and he was a good student, which did not surprise her. They read in the evenings, him in the chair by the sitting-room window with whatever he was reading. He went through books with the same focus he brought to everything. Her on the sofa, with her feet tucked under her, and the Sicilian light going golden through the shutters. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they were quiet in the same room, in the way that required nothing, which was the thing she'd noticed first about him in the hospital, and which had only deepened here. It was not without difficulty. There were nights when the treatment hit him hard, when the fatigue accumulated into something heavier than fatigue, when the nausea returned for a day or two and had to be managed, when she sat up through the dark hours, watching his breathing and logging his temperature, and being his nurse in the strict and immediate sense. He didn't pretend in those nights that he was fine. He'd stopped pretending somewhere in the hospital. He let her be what she was to him in those moments, competent, calm, the steady anchor she'd always been, and she was grateful for it, and told herself that the particular ache of watching him suffer was a clinical concern. She stopped lying to herself about it sometime around the 3rd month. There was a night, the specific light, the one she identified later as the moment the last carefully maintained distance collapsed, when he was sitting on the terrace at midnight, unable to sleep after a particularly hard infusion day, looking at the harbour lights in the darkness below. She brought him tea, the specific kind Dr. Fontana had recommended, ginger and honey, the thing that helped on the bad nights, and she was going to set it down and go back inside, and then she sat down instead. They sat there, on the terrace, in the Palermo midnight, with the city below and the sea beyond and the stars above, and after a long time he reached over and took her hand. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. She held his hand, and the Mediterranean moved in the dark below them, and nothing required a word. The conversation happened on a Saturday in late spring, when the air in Palermo smelled of jasmine and the sea, and the light was so precise it made everything it touched look like it was made of itself. They were on the terrace after dinner. She'd made pasta with pistachios and lemon, a recipe she'd learned from a woman at the market whose approach to instruction was to demonstrate exactly once and then watch you do it yourself. And the evening was warm and still, and the city below them was settling into its night sounds. She had been thinking for several days about something she needed to say. She'd been turning it over in the methodical way she turned over the things that mattered, looking at all the sides of it, making sure she was saying the right thing and not just the thing that was most convenient. "I've been thinking about my father," she said. He was very still beside her, not the dangerous stillness. She'd stopped confusing the two, but the attentive one, the one that meant, "I'm listening." "About what happened," she said, "and what it means now, what I've decided about it." He didn't speak. He waited. "I was angry for a very long time," she said. "Not just at you, at everything, at the situation, at the way things happen to people who don't deserve them, at the fact that someone can make a decision in a frightened room, and the cost of it gets paid by a child standing in a doorway." She looked at the harbour, at the lights on the water. "That anger it was mine. It was appropriate. I was allowed to it." "Yes," he said, "you were." "And I still am, in some ways. I don't think the anger goes away entirely. I'm not sure it should." She turned and looked at him. "But I've been thinking about what else is true, alongside the anger." A pause. "I've been thinking about a man who was 20 years old and building something in a city that wasn't his, and who made a decision in a moment of pressure that he couldn't undo, and about what that meant for the 23 years after." She held his gaze. "You didn't forget him. You could have. A lot of people would have." He was very quiet. "The scholarship wasn't guilt money," she said, "or not only. I've thought about this. The way it was structured, the way it tracked what I needed. That's not how you do something that's just about relieving your conscience. That's how you do something when you're watching." She breathed. "You watched?" "Yes," he said, and it landed heavy in the night air. "I don't know what to do with that," she said honestly, "but I'm not going to pretend it doesn't mean something." She looked at the water. "I'm not forgiving you, Marco. I don't think forgiveness works the way people say it does, like a door that opens once and everything on the other side is different. I think it's more like," she searched for the word, "like a long road, and I'm on it. I'm further along than I was when I walked onto that floor in October." He was looking at her with the expression she'd come to understand was what he looked like when he was being moved and refusing to pretend he wasn't. "That's more than I expected," he said. "More than I have any right to." "I know. I'm telling you anyway, because I don't see the point in having the truth and not using it." She looked at him directly. "I'm also telling you because I think you should know that the thing I am to you, whatever this is, isn't happening despite my father, or despite everything else I know about you. It's happening with all of it in the room, with my eyes open." He was quiet for a long time. "Sophia," he said finally. "What?" "I—" He stopped, started again. "I have never been Another stop, and she could see him working for it, the man who had 23 years of managing everything from behind the controlled surface of himself, reaching for something that didn't have a controlled surface. "Afraid," he said. "I have never been afraid of very many things. I've managed my whole life by eliminating the things that could make me afraid." And then he looked at her. "And then you walked into a room and did not look away from me, and I found that I was afraid of something very specific." "What?" she said quietly. "Of what it would mean if you left." The night was very still around them. "I'm not leaving," she said. He looked at her. "I chose to be here," she said. "I keep choosing it. That's what you need to understand about me. I don't do things by accident. I don't end up somewhere I didn't decide to go." She held his gaze. "I decided." He reached across the table and took her hand. The same gesture from the terrace at midnight, the same simple directness. And this time she turned her hand and held his back, and looked at him, and told him with her eyes what she'd already said with her words. "I'm here. I see you. I'm choosing this." He raised her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and it was not the gesture of a powerful man asserting possession. It was the gesture of a man receiving something he hadn't been sure he was allowed to want. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just make me coffee in the morning." The very small sound of his laugh, real laughter, rare and unguarded, went out into the Palermo night and dissolved into the jasmine-scented air, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, and the stars above them continued doing their ancient thing. The discharge came in August. Dr. Fontana delivered it with the particular satisfaction of a physician who has watched something improbable happen methodically and over time. The word remission first, then, a month later, the fuller and more certain word complete. Marco received it the way he received everything, with the controlled composure of a man who had decided not to show too much of what he received. Except that Sophia was there when Fontana said it, and she was standing close enough to see what happened to his face in the fraction of a second before the composure came back up. It looked like a rival, like a man who had been travelling for a very long time and had just recognized for the first time where he was. She did not say anything. She put her hand on his arm, just her hand. Just that. And he put his hand over it and squeezed once. And that was all. And it was entirely sufficient. They walked home from the clinic up the hill, the walk she'd taken hundreds of times in 6 months, past the market and the Baroque churches and the narrow streets where cats lived on the steps of ancient buildings. And the August light was doing what Sicilian August light did, which was to make everything it touched so present and exact and real that there was no possibility of avoiding it. They didn't talk until they reached the terrace. Then Marco stood at the railing and looked at the harbour for a long time. "I didn't believe I'd get here," he said. "I know," Sophia said. "I could tell." "When did you start believing it?" She thought about this seriously. "When you let me handle Rinaldi," she said. "Before that, you kept everything controlled. You managed everyone around you, including your own treatment. When you handed me that decision, I thought, he's doing the thing people do when they want to live. He's letting someone else in." He turned from the railing. He looked at her with the full weight of his attention, which had not diminished at all. She'd thought, maybe, that the treatment, the discharge, the resolution of the immediate crisis would ease it. It hadn't. If anything, it was more present, the way things are when they no longer have to be hidden. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me." "I've done things in my life that I can't undo." He said it looking at her, not away, never away when it mattered. "I'm not going to spend the rest of my life performing penance for them. I don't think that's what's owed. But I'm also not going to pretend they're nothing." A pause. "I want to do something with what's left that doesn't continue the cost, that isn't costing other people." She nodded. She was listening very carefully. "I don't know what that looks like yet," he said. "I know it's in Palermo. I know it involves this house." He looked at her. "I know it involves you, if you'll continue to decide to be here." "I'll keep deciding," she said. "Then I'll keep—" He stopped. He was working for it again, the sentence that came from the new place, and she waited. "I'll keep trying to be what you can look at without regret." The city below them made its sounds, the afternoon sounds of Palermo, traffic and voices and the distant bells of a church, and the light went gold and long across the terrace, and she looked at this man who was standing in his own life for what she thought might be the first time, trying to do the thing the grandmother in Palermo had told him: "Know what you stand for, and stand for it." "You're already something I don't regret," she said. He breathed. "Come here," she said, because she was done letting him stand there alone with something that didn't require distance. He crossed the terrace, and she took his face in her hands, the same hands that had held syringe and chart and his wrist in a corridor, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them looked away. She kissed him. He kissed her back, and his hands went to her waist and held her the way he held things he didn't want to lose, which was carefully and completely, and the Sicilian evening went gold and warm around them and said nothing, because it had been here for thousands of years and had seen everything, and it understood. The most surprising thing about the life they built was how ordinary it was. Not small. There was nothing small about the house on the hill, or the view of the sea, or the accumulated weight of everything they were to each other, but ordinary in the way that good things are ordinary, the rhythm of daily life so particular and specific that it became its own country with its own language and customs and private textures. She went to work at 8. The clinic had given her a full-time position in October when it became clear she was staying, and she'd built, over the months, the kind of relationships with her patients that she'd always been best at, the honest, skilled, present kind. She was good at her work here, the way she'd been good at it in Miami, but with something added, the unhurriedness of a place that didn't operate on emergency department time, where people stayed long enough for you to know them. He made coffee in the mornings. This was the detail she hadn't anticipated, and which turned out to be one of the daily things that most precisely communicated what had changed. Marco Esposito, who had been served by a personal chef for 11 years and who had never expressed an interest in domestic labour of any kind, had developed, she had watched this happen over the winter, gradually, with the same focused attention he brought to learning anything, a precise and unironic engagement with the mocha pot on the stovetop. He researched the coffee. He ordered specific beans from a roaster in Naples. He had a method, the grind, the tamp, the heat, the specific quality of the first hiss of the pot. and he applied the method with the focused concentration of someone who had decided that this small thing was worth doing correctly. Every morning when she came downstairs, the coffee was on the kitchen counter, exactly as she liked it, not sweet, short, strong, with a small glass of water beside it. He never asked if she wanted it. He made it, and it was there, and she drank it. And they stood in the kitchen in the morning light with their coffee and talked or didn't, and it was the most domestic and the most radical thing she'd ever experienced, and she loved it. The word love had arrived sometime in the winter without announcing itself, the way real things sometimes did, not with the drama of a declaration, but simply already there when you looked. She hadn't said it yet. Neither had he. This was also, she thought, very them. The honesty between them was real and deep, but it moved at its own pace, and neither of them pushed. He called Miami in November. She knew about it. He told her he was going to, and she was at work when it happened, which was probably the right way. He called his second and gave the final instructions. The evidence from the internal faction had been delivered to the right places. The organizations that had been watching for it had been very grateful, and the succession plan he'd been quietly running for the past year was complete. He was out. When she came home that evening, he was on the terrace with a glass of wine, looking at the water. She sat down beside him. "How does it feel?" she said. He thought about it. He always thought seriously when she asked him something. "Like putting down something heavy," he said, "that you've been carrying so long, you forgot it was heavy." A pause. "And like grief, that was also there." "Grief for what?" "For what I built, for what it cost." He looked at the wine in the glass. "For all the years of being very good at something that I should have questioned more and didn't." She looked at the water. "Grief is appropriate," she said. "It doesn't mean you did the wrong thing now." "No," he agreed. "It just means it was real." They sat in the evening air for a while. "There's something I want to do," he said eventually, "in Overtown, an investment, anonymous, a community centre, the kind of place that has a medical clinic attached and after-school programs." He looked at her sideways. "I wanted to ask if you thought it was the right kind of thing." She thought about Overtown, about the streets she'd walked and the friends she'd had and the tyre repair shop below the apartment and the particular quality of light in the evenings there, about what it had needed, then and now. "Yes," she said, "that's the right kind of thing." He nodded. He went back to looking at the water. She put her hand on his arm and left it there. "Marco," she said. "What?" "I love you." The evening went very still. He turned and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and what was in his face was the most unguarded thing she'd seen there, which was saying something after everything. "I know," he said. "I've known for a while." "Say it." A pause. "Sophia." "Marco." The near laugh in his eyes, and then something deeper behind it, the thing that had been growing for a year, the thing that had been in the hospital room and on the terrace and in the kitchen with the mocha pot and in the Palermo nights when she held his hand in the dark. "I love you," he said. I don't have a more elegant way of saying it than that." "That was elegant enough," she said. He pulled her toward him, and she went, and his arm went around her, and they sat in the Palermo evening with the city below them and the sea beyond that, and the ordinary, extraordinary life they had built continued doing what it did. There were still hard nights. She had known there would be. Dr. Webb had told her. Dr. Fontana had told her. The research was very clear on this, and she'd known it in the way you know things before you know them in your body, which is to say, incompletely. The after effects of chemotherapy were not a clean ending. They were a long and variable trail, some weeks better, some weeks worse. The specific combination of fatigue and nerve sensitivity and the occasional nausea that had no predictable trigger. His immune system required monitoring. His blood work required quarterly checks. He had a category of bad nights that were not medically alarming, but were exhausting in a way that was different from ordinary exhaustion. A deep, cell-level depletion that no amount of sleep quite fixed. She managed it. That was who she was. It was what she did. And she managed it with the competence and care that had always been hers. But with something added now. The particular attention of someone who managed these things because the person was hers, which was both professionally compromising and entirely non-negotiable. On the bad nights, she would hear him. She'd learned his sleep, the way she'd learned everything else about him, learned the specific change in his breathing that meant he was awake and in discomfort. And she would get up and come to him. She didn't do anything dramatic. She would sit on the edge of the bed, or sit beside him if he'd moved to the chair by the window again, and she would hold his hand and say nothing. And sometimes that was enough, and sometimes it wasn't quite enough. But it was what was available, and she'd learned a long time ago that what's available is often exactly sufficient. One night in November, a year after the 13th floor, just past the anniversary of the first day she'd stepped off the elevator and walked toward a door with guards on either side of it. He was awake at 3 a.m., and she was sitting beside him in the dark room with the shutters open on the night air, and the stars were doing their thing over the Mediterranean. "Do you ever regret it?" he said. "Coming here?" "No," she said. "Even the hard parts." "The hard parts are part of it," she said. "You don't get to have the real thing and skip the hard parts. That's not how it works." He was quiet for a moment. "I know you're not a good person," she said, or began to say. It was something she'd been carrying, the full version of it, for months. She'd said pieces of it to him in various ways, but not the whole of it. Not the version that came from the deepest part of where she was standing. He turned and looked at her. The starlight caught his face, and the year of good living had done something to him. There was more colour now, and less of the drawn exhaustion of the hospital room, and something in the set of his face that had settled, like a man who has stopped fighting a current and is moving with it instead. "I know," he said. "You've done things that cost people. Some of them people I loved, and more people I didn't know, but who mattered to someone the way my father mattered to me." "Yes," he said. "That's true." "And I know all of that," she said. "I came here knowing all of that. I'm here now knowing all of that." "I know. But I'm trying," she said. "For me, that's enough." He looked at her. "Trying what?" he said quietly. "Trying to believe that people can be more than the worst of what they've done. That what you do after matters. That the long road is real." She looked at him steadily, in the dark, with the Mediterranean outside the window and the city below asleep and the year of this life between them. "I'm not naive. I see what you were and what it cost. But I also see what you're doing now and what it means, and I'm choosing to live in both of those things at once." He was very quiet. "That's more generosity than I've earned," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but it's what I have, and I'm offering it." He reached for her hand. She gave it to him. He held it in both of his, the way he held things he valued, completely, as though the holding itself was a kind of statement. "I'm going to try," he said. "For every day I have left, I'm going to try to be worth that." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm here." The night moved around them, and the stars continued their ancient, indifferent routine, and the man who had once been the most powerful and perhaps the loneliest person she'd ever known sat beside her in the dark and held her hand, and she held his back, and neither of them needed anything else. The morning she wants to remember, the one she will, she thinks, carry for the rest of her life, the way her father carried the smell of motor oil and came home, is not a dramatic one. It is spring again. A year and a half after Palermo, the house on the hill is theirs in every way it can be. The terrace has a lemon tree in a terracotta pot that she bought at the market on an impulse, and that Marco watered once and then took full responsibility for, which is something she teases him about, and which he accepts with the near expression of a man who has accepted that being teased by someone who loves you is one of the better things a life can contain. The lemon tree is blooming this morning, small white flowers, impossibly fragrant, catching the light that comes through the hills at this hour like something solid. She wakes early. She almost always wakes early, the body's long habit, and he is asleep beside her, which is itself a thing she has not stopped noticing. The man who couldn't sleep, who spent 3 months unable to move between states of consciousness without something pulling him back to wakefulness, who sat at hospital windows at 3 a.m. looking at cities with the exhaustion of someone who had been going forward so long he'd forgotten how to stop. That man, in his own house, in Palermo, in the morning, is asleep. She gets up carefully, not to wake him. She goes downstairs in the thin, early light, and she makes the coffee, with his method, which she has absorbed the way she absorbs most things about him, completely and without deciding to. And she stands in the kitchen with the mocha pot on the stove, and through the kitchen window she can see the terrace and the lemon tree, and beyond it the beginning of the day over the Mediterranean. She is thinking about her patients. The Tuesday schedule has 3 she's been watching closely, and she turns them over in her mind with the attention they deserve, while the coffee hisses and spits and fills the kitchen with its smell. She is thinking about her father. She does this less often than she used to, less with grief, more with the particular quality of memory that comes when loss has had time to become something you carry instead of something that carries you. She thinks about his hands, which were large like Marco's and always warm. She thinks about the way he laughed, from his belly, the way her mother said she'd married him because of the laugh. She thinks about him the way you think about someone who is gone but not forgotten, which is to say, with love, without the hope of undoing it, and with the knowledge that their life mattered and was real and cannot be erased by what happened after. She thinks, I would have wanted him to know I'm all right. And then she thinks, I am all right. The coffee is ready. She pours it, and she hears, from upstairs, the specific change in the house that means he's awake, the shift of weight, the sound of the window being opened to let the morning in. And she pours a second cup. She hears his footsteps on the stairs, the steady, unhurried sound of a man who is no longer in a hurry, who has discovered that arrival is different from forward motion, and that arrival is better. He appears in the kitchen doorway. He's in the grey t-shirt and dark trousers he wears in the mornings before changing for whatever the day requires, and his hair is not yet managed, and she looks at him every morning, and it does the thing she's stopped being surprised by, the thing that happens in her chest when she sees him in an unguarded moment. He looks like himself, the truest version, the one that exists before the careful composure of presentation comes up, and it is not the version she would have seen in any photograph, not the Mafia boss, or the powerful man, or the patient, or the person who walked through events that should have broken him. It is just Marco, at 43, in the morning, in his kitchen in Palermo, coming to get his coffee. "Morning," he says. "Morning," she says, and hands him the cup. He takes it. He stands beside her at the kitchen window and looks at the lemon tree on the terrace. And she stands beside him, and they drink their coffee, and the light comes up over the Mediterranean the way it has come up over the Mediterranean every morning since before anyone was alive to see it, and will continue to do after they are both gone. He says, "What's the day like?" She says, "I have the Rossi follow-up at 10 and a new intake at 2. You?" "Call with the solicitors in the morning, and Giuseppe wants to discuss the drainage on the north wall." "You should let him fix the drainage." "I know. I want to understand it first." "You want to be involved." "I want to understand what I'm agreeing to." He looks at her sideways. "Is that a problem?" "No," she says. "It's very you." That's an interesting thing to say in a neutral tone. I'm a nurse. We have a neutral tone for everything. The near laugh. God, she loves the near laugh. The thing that lives just beneath the surface of him. The thing that came up slowly over a year and a half and now lives close enough to the surface to be available at any time. "You're not just a nurse," he says. "No," she agrees. "I'm not just a nurse." He looks at her. She looks at him. "You're a lot of things," he says, and the voice is quiet and direct and means all the things he means when his voice does that. "So are you," she says. She meets his gaze. Most of them worth having around. The morning light is doing extraordinary things now, the way Sicilian morning light does extraordinary things, and the lemon tree is doing its business in the fragrance, and below them Palermo is waking up, the bells, the traffic, the sound of a city that has survived everything and will continue to do so. "Sophia," he says. "What?" He looks at her for a moment, and she waits, because she has learned to wait for him, learned the value of letting him arrive at the thing in his own time. "I don't know what I did," he says slowly, "in whatever accounting exists, to get here, to this, to—" He looks at the kitchen and the terrace and the morning and her. "I know what I did wrong. I know the full weight of that. I'm not asking for an equation that makes it come out even, because there isn't one." "No," she says, "there isn't." "But I'm grateful," he says. "I want you to know that, for whatever this is, for you choosing it, for every morning." A pause. "For staying when you didn't have to." She looks at him. "I know you're not a good person," she says. "I know, he says. "But I'm trying," she says. "For me, that's enough." He's quiet for a moment. And then, "I'm trying too," he says. "Every day." "I know," she says. "I see it." He takes her hand. She gives him hers. They stand at the window in the morning, in the house on the hill above the Mediterranean, with the lemon tree and the ancient light and the city waking below, and they hold on to each other, not desperately, not from fear, but from the deep and ordinary and extraordinary choice of two people who have looked at everything and decided this. Here, you. She goes to work. He makes more coffee and waits. At noon, she comes back up the hill, and the house is here, and so is he. And she walks through the door, and he looks up from whatever he's reading, and that is the whole of it, the whole ordinary, extraordinary thing. And it is, she thinks, watching his face open toward her the way good things open toward light. It is entirely enough. It is more than enough. It is everything. I know you're not a good person. I know. But I'm trying. For me, that's enough. 1 year later. The Overtown Community Centre opened on a Wednesday in March, quietly, without fanfare, in a converted warehouse on the corner of Northwest 7th Avenue. The building had a medical clinic on the ground floor, staffed by 2 rotating physicians and 3 nurses. It had 4 classrooms above and a courtyard in the back with a mural of the Miami skyline painted by a teenager who lived 4 blocks away. The donation was anonymous. The organization running it was a non-profit with a complicated paper trail that led eventually to a law firm in Palermo. No one looked that hard. In Palermo, in the house on the hill, Sophia found the newspaper article about the opening on her phone one morning in April, while Marco was in the kitchen doing his deliberate thing with the mocha pot. She looked at the photograph, the ribbon cutting, the smiling faces of the people who would run the clinic, the mural in the courtyard, for a long time. "Marco," she called. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. She held up the phone. He looked at the screen for a moment. Neither of them said anything. After a while, he went back to the coffee. She put her phone down and looked out at the terrace and the lemon tree and the sea beyond. She thought about her father, about motor oil and warm hands and a belly laugh and a canal and a doorway. About 22 years and an envelope of receipts and a syringe set down. About the long road of forgiveness, which is not a door that opens once, but a road you walk every day and which goes somewhere and which she is on. She thought, I think he'd know. And then Marco put the coffee on the kitchen table and sat down across from her, and she picked up her cup, and the Palermo morning came in through the windows, and the hill held the house, and the sea held the hill, and the day began.